Good afternoon, everyone.
I just had to say hello. I want to make sure you got in.
I'm in.
I'm ready for it. I'm going off now.
Okay. I trust all is well as we are continuing in this opportunity to be engaged with each other. This morning or this afternoon, I'm on Eastern Time. Um, I will be presenting to you um, on the topic Building a Set Curriculum for Ethnic Studies, Incorporating Scholarship, Experiential Learning, and Teaching. Um, let's see. Oh, wait, hold on. Okay. And so in today's session, we will start out with a brief introduction that gives us some idea as to how we are engaged in this session and move on to defining both curriculum and ethnic studies. And then we're going to talk about the ways in which we can actually build a curriculum for K 12 ethnic studies programs, focusing on scholarship, experiential learning, and we'll talk about what experiential learning is, and travel and the ways in which those things can be incorporated into a curriculum for ethnic studies. As we get engaged in this topic, I think it's important for us to understand a couple of things as assumptions from the top. And the first of which is that not everyone understands curriculum the same way. And school systems have one understanding of curriculum, school boards have a completely different understanding of curriculum. Classroom educators have a different understanding, and those of us who work in higher education and who teach in areas of curriculum have different understandings also, not only within higher education, but also within sets of higher education. As a curriculum studies scholar, I primarily focus on these notions of knowledge as constructed by Herbert Spencer. He asked two very important questions in the context of curriculum. The first question, what knowledge is most worth knowing? The second, who determines what knowledge is most worth knowing? Curriculum studies scholars see these as curricular questions, that knowledge and the construction of knowledge, the production of knowledge, and the consumption of knowledge are all important in relationship to how we understand curriculum. And from that viewpoint, I will be talking about how we engage in the development and implementation of curriculum for ethnic studies in a K 12 setting. So we've got a couple of different things here in relationship to defining curriculum. Franklin Bobbitt, who is an early curriculum study scholar who really focused on curriculum as a set of goals and objectives, defines curriculum in two ways. First, the entire range of experiences, both undirected and directed, concerned in unfolding the abilities of the individual. He also says that curriculum is a series of consciously directed training experiences that the schools use for completing and perfecting the unfoldment. This second definition is the one that most schools and school districts seem to focus on, how to basically deliberately and intentionally train individuals in a school setting on a particular set of information that they have in fact deemed important to know. The second definition comes from Elliot Eisner, who is a 20th century curriculum studies scholar, who says that historically, the word has its roots in the Latin word currere, which means a course to be run, or as curriculum studies scholar William Pinar would say, to run the course. He also says that it is a course of predetermined, required subject matter classes that students must pass to graduate. This is here again a definition that we find that most school districts and school systems engage in. But the first set of definitions for both bullet points are definitions that curriculum studies scholars who understand curriculum in the context of a lived experience, the things we have to know inside and outside of school, really address the range of experiences and the things that we learn from those experiences. When we talk about ethnic studies and define ethnic studies, we need to understand three very important components. First, the interdisciplinary nature of ethnic studies. It is an interdisciplinary studies of race and ethnicity from the perspective of unrepresented minority groups covered in its study. The second part of that definition is especially important in relationship to curriculum scholars, and particularly in response to Herbert Spencer's second question about who determines what knowledge is most worth knowing. For ethnic studies, the determination of the knowledge most worth knowing is made by those individuals who are part of those ethnic groups. And we'll talk more about the significance of that kind of knowledge as we move forward. The second bullet point addresses that ethnic studies traditionally include studies about Asian and Asian American populations, Black, Africana, and African American studies, Chicanx or Latinx studies, and Native American studies. These are all groups of individuals who have been included in under the umbrella of underrepresented minority groups in the United States. Ethnic studies as an interdisciplinary studies has contributions from a lot of different fields, but also contributes to a lot of different fields. The contributions from the fields are in such from such fields as anthropology, art, history, law, literature, music, political science, sociology, and many others. But when we think about interdisciplinarity and the way in which Repko, who is an interdisciplinary research scholar, talks about it, there are contributions to other fields from ethnic studies. So when we think about the fields of medicine, social work, as recipients of information that has been important in relationship to ethnic studies, imagine a physician who has engaged in an ethnic studies class and the way in which they might address their care for someone from an Asian American community. That care might be received very differently because they have some knowledge in the way in which that particular community engages in their own medical health. And so when we talk about this notions of contributions from and contributions to, we know ethnic studies does have an impact on the way in which individuals engage in the world. So when we think about K-12 ethnic studies curriculum and the scholarship that is available in relationship to that, we also have to think about it from an interdisciplinary viewpoint. So in the fields and areas of reading, language arts, English composition, and English literature, we find that ethnic studies has a way in which it has received contributions from such scholars as Langston Hughes, Toni Morrison, Amy Tan, Sandra Cisneros, and many others. So, what does that look like to include the contributions of these kinds of scholars in this particular subject matter? In many school systems, students have required kinds of assignments and assessments. And when we think about the scholarship that should be included in these kinds of assignments and assessments, there are lots of ways to do that. But the first thing that is significantly important is to think about what would scholars from these communities say is important to know. And I'll repeat, what do we believe that scholars from these particular fields would say is important to know? So when we think about that question, we also have to think about the educators who are also in these fields, who come from underrepresented minority groups. What would they say would be important to know in relationship to those topics in education that relate to reading, language arts, English composition, and English literature? What kinds of things that they find made a significant difference in their learning experience as a result of reading certain literature? So I'll provide an example. Um, at one point, I spent some time in Macon, Georgia, while I was on faculty at Mercer University, volunteering at an elementary school in a reading classroom for third graders. And students in that classroom were reading material that lots of third graders found themselves typically reading across the country: stories, short stories, and reading assignments that had sort of a generic viewpoint in relationship to US society. Things that were sort of commonplace, stories about getting ready for school, or stories about going on a trip. Many of us read these kinds of stories in readers that were provided to students, where they had to think about what they had read, what the relationship is between some one part of the story and another part of the story. But how do we know that these stories are really reflective of the students that we are teaching? And what would these students and their family members say would be stories that could, in fact, give us the same kinds of opportunities for students to comprehend in their reading assignments and to analyze in their reading assignments from elementary school through high school? So, for instance, is there an opportunity for students to read African tales, or those kinds of stories that come from um, communities that are being valued within those communities? And then how do we then take the same kinds of skills that we want students to be able to perform and to acquire and then to master from talking about reading and language arts and composition, and different kinds of literature that do reflect those kinds of things? So, for instance, I remember teaching a social studies methods course while I was a postdoctoral research scholar that discussed the ways in which their schooling experiences really sort of had many elements of the social studies in it. But one of the beautiful things about having an ethnic studies curriculum built into the K-12 experience that it's an opportunity for an integrated curriculum to appear. One of the pre-service teachers in this class, in the social studies methods class that I taught, talked about the impact of reading the Joy Luck Club while she was in school, um, on her own desire to become an Asian American teacher who taught in an Asian American school, a school that was largely populated by Asian American students. And the fact that she was still able to get out of that particular reading the ability to engage in reading comprehension and analysis, and to really engage in critical thinking skills in relationship to that particular text. All of those skills are available in relationship to the kinds of ways in which we want students to produce knowledge and to construct knowledge and engage with the information. But there are opportunities also to do that from an ethnic studies perspective. When we think about English composition, the things that we want students to be able to write about, or in language arts classes at the lower grade levels, where are there opportunities for students to engage in poetry, similar to the work of Nikki Giovanni or Langston Hughes? Where are there opportunities for students to be able to write about their own experiences from their identity perspectives? And to be able to do that in a way that also provides students the ability to build on their writing skills. And so incorporating ethnic studies into a K-12 curriculum for reading, language arts, English composition, and English literature does not have to lean on much of the same kind of work that we've been engaged in for a long period of time. That there are opportunities to read and engage in stories and other kinds of information in relationship to the skills that we want students to learn. So now let's turn to history, economics, social studies, and geography, and the ways in which that subject matter could, in fact, incorporate ethnic studies. Now, one of the things that many scholars might believe to be true is that this particular topic area might be the easiest in which ethnic studies could appear. And to a certain degree, there seems to be a great deal of synergy in the way in which ethnic studies curriculums have aligned with things like history and geography. But there are also ways in which areas like economics and geography can actually enhance how we incorporate ethnic studies. So when we talk, for instance, about Native American communities' contributions in the war effort during World War II, and the story of the code breakers that emerges as a result of the involvement of Native American communities during that time frame. There are lots of ways in which we can talk about how this particular community of military personnel were able to not only increase the economic viability of their own communities by having the opportunity to serve, but also the geographic areas in which many of these military personnel called home, from which they were coming, and the shared language and culture that they had that made it possible for them to participate in developing code that was very useful to the war effort. And why did this particular group exist in the first place? What is the story of the development of the idea around having Native American military personnel serve as code developers and code breakers in the war effort? And then when we think about the fact that the war effort had a tremendous economic boon to the American population in relationship to the kinds of resources that were flowing in and out to support the war effort, how did the war effort, in fact, either promote economics in Native American communities? And then how did the war effort have some sort of negative impact on those same communities? When we think about World War II, we also have to think about what happened to Japanese Americans during that time frame and the economic impact of their being moved to internment camps, and the ways in which those communities had to find ways to bolster their economic viability. All of these things are part of the economics of not only during the war, but when we think about 21st century economics in relationship to these same communities, and how this particular moment in our understanding of economics may have had an influence on what we understand about economics today for these communities. History plays a tremendous role in ethnic studies as well. And there are lots of opportunities to talk about African American communities and the appearance of Africans in North America and Central America as a result of a number of different things. But most significantly, as a result of the enslavement of African peoples on this side of the world. But one story that doesn't get told very often is about the Africans that lived in the Yucatan Peninsula many, many years before the enslavement of African peoples in the Western Hemisphere, and how that has changed the way in which that particular group of individuals have lived in that particular area, and how it's really changed even the way in which Native peoples in that particular area of Central America have evolved. But what's also interesting is the fact that after World War II, we find that as a result of some of the discrimination that many African Americans may have suffered upon returning from the war, that some of them actually moved to Mexico to rebuild their lives. And so, do we know the relationship between the early Africans that lived in that particular area and those that moved into that area in the mid 20th century? When we think about geography and the ways in which the United States has shifted and changed over time, and what became the United States versus what was the United States 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and how the shift of the boundaries may have influenced what we now know about where certain communities are. So, one of the things that I often did in my social studies methods course was to have students prepare a lesson where they could track the evolution of their own families from one place to another. So, for instance, people who immigrated into the country, where did they typically land? Where did they move to or resettle into after they immigrated into a particular space? Knowing those things and how particular ethnic populations shifted as a result of that is interesting in relationship to geography of the country. So, for instance, I was very interested in the fact that there is a large Vietnamese community in the Houston area doing much of the same work that they did prior to immigrating into the United States. Now, what we would love to know in relationship to that is this a community that immigrated into that area, or did they come from some other area in the United States first? When we think about geography and social studies and history, there's also an opportunity to talk about the ways in which colonization influences culture for certain ethnic communities. So, for instance, when we talk about the French influence in Vietnam, in high school, students have the opportunity to learn about the Vietnam conflict and some of the things that occurred in that. But prior to that conflict, the French government had colonized that particular area of the world and left its mark on that particular area of the world in relationship to architecture and food and probably many other things. And so when we think about even Vietnamese individuals that immigrated into the United States post war, they also brought with them that French influence that was part of their identity after 100 years of colonization of the French in that particular region. So, all of these particular things provide us with opportunities to learn about different ethnic groups in the context of history, economics, social studies, and geography. When we think about ethnic studies curriculum in the context of the sciences, and particularly biology, chemistry, environmental science, and environmental studies, there are lots of opportunities to engage in the ways in which different ethnic groups have influenced our understanding of this subject matter. So, for instance, I think about Dr. Charles Drew, who created the system by which we have blood transfusion and was not only a medical doctor but studied biology. And what is the significance of knowing how this process works and how it has even today influenced the way we understand medicine? When we think about chemistry, it's interesting that chemistry shows up in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. In the making of silk, and something that Chinese communities understand in relationship to fabric, and even in understanding the coloration of fabrics in other parts of the world, such as on the African continent and in South America, where different kinds of plants are used to dye certain fabrics and textiles. That is a form of chemistry. And imagine if students had the opportunity to engage in that kind of work as part of their learning, and even in something that I didn't necessarily enjoy while I was in middle school, but had the opportunity to do, was in a home economics course. One of the things that we are now learning is that there is a science to food and how food functions in our bodies, and what foods are available and what we do to food in order to grow food. How is that important to certain communities? And then when we think about that, how is that important to places that have been identified as food deserts and where they're getting their food from? What is the science connected to that? And are certain communities and certain ethnic groups more prone to engaging in these kinds of hard questions than other groups? There's also the opportunity to engage in environmental science and environmental studies, and where we put certain things that impact on certain ethnic communities. So, for instance, are there certain ethnic communities tend to living in places where there might be um, a wastewater plant or an energy plant of some sort? Are certain communities more likely to be in areas where there are parks and lots of trees? And what is the development in relationship to those ethnic communities who might be living in certain areas where the environment could be enhanced or harmed by the existence of some external thing? Those are part of the questions that we have to engage in, and there is scholarship that supports that. And then finally, when we think about the scholarship of ethnic studies in K 12 curriculums, we also have to think about the ways in which art history, dance, and music influence the kinds of things that we could be teaching in a curriculum that involves these topics but integrates ethnic studies into these topics. Where are there opportunities to learn about Native American songs, such as the Cherokee Memorial Song that's sung at some funerals, to learn about the Harlem Renaissance period and the art and poetry and literature that was created out of that period? Where are there opportunities for students to learn about Chinese calligraphy and other sort of artful ways in which individuals communicate in writing? So there are also these kinds of opportunities and lots of scholarship to support the ways in which these things can appear and be supported in the curriculum. When we think about ethnic studies and experiential learning, I want to talk about two key components of experiential learning that is important for folks to consider, and then how those two components can be incorporated into an ethnic studies curriculum. The first of which is service learning, opportunities that are available to students at all grade levels that provide them not only for learning, but also to give to the community. So, we're talking about this notion of embedding volunteer opportunities in the context of cultural spaces or in cultural knowledge. And at all grade levels, there are opportunities to do that. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. When we talk about experiential learning, we're also talking about internships. We're talking about opportunities for students to learn and work. And so this is really about embedding paid or unpaid work experiences in the context of cultural knowledge and spaces. And this is typically happening in a K-12 setting, and more specifically for grades 10 through 12. And so opportunities for service learning in ethnic studies can happen in lots of different ways. So if students are studying something such as reading a story about a young girl who might be from an Asian American community, um, who wants to grow a particular kind of plant or tree, right? Would there be an opportunity then for students to grow a seedling in class, um, connected to their science instruction after reading this story about a young girl, of trying to grow a particular plant in her garden, and then to take that seedling to a community garden where they could plant their seedlings, and provide those plants to that community so that they could, in fact, have that particular produce available in that community. There are opportunities for middle school students to do things such as volunteering, to sit with elderly people and read to them based on a particular book or story that they may have written themselves, um, and to volunteer to do that while at the same time to practice their reading and or presentation skills, to write stories or letters, to pen pals in other countries in their home language or in English that they could send out. Pen pal writing has been part of the volunteer experience for schools for many, many years, and have provided students opportunities to write about their cultural experiences, to learn about cultural experiences from other students, and to practice their writing skills. When we think about internship opportunities, this tends to be for older students, although at one time or another, um, l- latter part of middle school was also an opportunity for students to engage in an unpaid internship work experience. This is not only an opportunity for students to explore, an opportunity to engage in something that they think they might want to do as a career, but it's also an opportunity to teach students some skills in relationship to work ethic. But in the context of cultural knowledge or cultural spaces, it also provides an opportunity for students to learn more about a particular cultural group. So, for instance, students could, in fact, make a decision to work as a teacher's aide if they're interested in becoming a teacher, at an elementary school if they're in middle school or high school, but they might choose to select a school that has an ethnic population that is different from their own. So if they are volunteering to read to students in an elementary school or be a teacher's aide in an elementary school that is largely populated by a Mexican American community, um, that would give them an opportunity to know more about that particular community, how they function, the things that they like to do, and things connected to their language that they may not necessarily have an opportunity to do otherwise. Internships for high school students can provide opportunities for students to work in areas where they could gain a general skill, but also be able to do work that is important to that community. So, if there is a museum or cultural center for a particular ethnic group, where volunteers could function as a docent or a front desk person, to assist while having the opportunity to learn more about that particular community through the engagement of that space. This would certainly be one way to incorporate ethnic studies into the curriculum for all kinds of classes that you might be able to do with. But this is an opportunity that requires close communication with the local communities. Sending our students in to opportunities like these without first ensuring that the community is engaged in conversations about what kinds of things they need to have support for, and then ensuring that students have been prepared to engage in those opportunities in a way that is meaningful for them and for the curriculum. And so those things have to work in tandem in order to be effective toward the learning of those students in an ethnic studies curriculum. Finally, when we think about a K-12 ethnic studies curriculum in relationship to travel, there are lots of opportunities locally and externally for students to learn about ethnic studies and gain information in the context of cultural knowledges and spaces. Locally, there are opportunities for students to, as a class or as cluster groups or as individuals, to visit historic spaces related to various ethnic community experiences. Lots of places around the country have museums and even marked sites around the cities and other communities that tell the story of particular ethnic groups. Going on a field trip, visiting museums, and doing something that I call adventure hunts as part of the community, the curriculum that you're engaging in, whether it's part of your reading assignment or history assignment or something that you're doing for dance or music or art, is a really great way to embed cultural knowledge into the curriculum. These adventure hunts, cultural searches that can occur inside or outside of the classroom. Inside of the classroom, it might be just an activity or an exercise, web based or paper based, where students have to be able to identify where might you find a place that discusses the immigration of Chinese people to the United States, or where are the places in the United States that have large Nigerian populations, or where in the United States do we have um, Native American government reservations where large Native American populations have been living for a while, right? As opposed to where Native American populations came from. So to create maybe a map that shows from where many of our Native American communities originated and then where they might be currently living today. But there are also opportunities to also bring people in who have personal stories or expert knowledge in relationship to cultural groups to talk about some of the things that are related to the curriculum that you're offering. Now, one of the things we want to warn against, however, in relationship to building this ethnic studies curriculum is that here again, the knowledge and expertise should be determined by the cultural group and not necessarily by the individuals who are in charge of education in general for the school system or the school. We have to honor the knowledge they bring to include honoring what isn't appropriate. So, for instance, if we're teaching an ethnic studies curriculum, it needs to be interdisciplinary and not as an add-on to a reading class or a social studies class. And that it is something that sort of lives in that particular space. Um, Finally, I want to talk a little bit about external travel, which tends to be for the older grades. This is important because sometimes some of the things that need to be part of the ethnic studies curriculum may not be physically located near where the school site is located. And so it might require travel that shouldn't be more than 4 hours away from the school site, that really sort of has an opportunity to engage in an interdisciplinary, integrated ethnic studies curriculum and provide students an opportunity to see and experience things they couldn't possibly see or experience in their local area. So, trips should cover information that is attached to particular ethnic groups and people, what resources are there in relationship to those individuals, why that geographic site is important, what the history is, how that has evolved over time, what are some of the environmental issues connected to those things, and to ensure that there are school or school-like assignments embedded in that trip where students can engage in writing and presentation skills as part of that particular external travel experience, but ensuring all along the way, as the curriculum is being designed, that individuals who are part of the cultural groups being covered in that curriculum really get centered in what knowledge is most worth knowing. And so, in closing, I want to really sort of emphasize that scholarship, experiential learning, and travel should be part of an ethnic studies curriculum, that everything cannot happen in the context of a scripted curriculum inside of a classroom. And that, more importantly, the individuals who are, in fact, members of these underrepresented minority groups should be front and center, most important in relationship in determining what knowledge is most worth knowing, not just making decisions about how to add things in, because this is not an additive kind of curriculum, but it's rather interdisciplinary, trying to teach only ethnic studies from a historical vantage point or from a reading or literature vantage point does not honor the true nature of an ethnic studies curriculum. It must be interdisciplinary, and it should include experiences such as scholarship, experiential learning, and travel, and must come from the perspective of the individuals who are, in fact, central to how we know ethnic studies. And that is those individuals who are, in fact, self identified as members of the underrepresented minority groups. I want to thank you for your time this afternoon, and feel free to contact me for questions or to engage in discussion. I will be more than happy to engage with you further as we continue this discussion around a K 12 ethnic studies curriculum. Thank you.